So hello everyone, and welcome to this very special conversation with three innovative leaders in the industry, each bringing a very different perspective today. And each of these people I'm talking to today is a transformational leader in their own rights, and will be able to contribute a lot to this conversation. For those of you that don't know me, I am a Padma Shri warrior. I have been in the technology industry for a very long time as a global business leader. I've been a very passionate advocate for women and people of color in the tech industry. I just recently started a company. We just launched our product 2 weeks back called Fable, yay. And our mission at Fable is to deliver the world's best experiences for reading, together and discovering great books and reading those great books with friends. And all of this is in service of mental wellness and mental well-being. So today with me is Jeff Lawson, who's the founder and CEO of a small company called Twilio that he's built from scratch. I'm kidding. It's a massive company, public company. Jeff recently launched his book, his baby. It's called Ask Your Developer, How to Harness the Power of Software Developers and Win in the 21st Century. It's a great book and talks a lot about how the creative power of software is actually a lot of times underestimated, and how we tend to think about developers as very distinct and separate from business. And in fact, they could be very creative problem solvers and a partner to business leaders. So it's a great book. I recommend everyone reading that. Plug for Jeff's book on my behalf. Jeff also curated a portfolio recently. We launch through what we call folios, which is a collection. We go to industry experts and ask them to choose 6 great books to read together. And Jeff curated a folio for us. And in his folio, he has Carol's book called Success Through Diversity: Why the Most Inclusive Companies Will Win. So Carol Fulp is the author of that book, and she is a public speaker, strategic advisor to many, many CEOs and senior executives. She's very passionate about diversity, inclusion in company cultures and beyond, which is top of mind topic for all of us, given everything we went through in 2020, but it'll always be, I think, a very important topic. Carol uses her research to evolve organizations to the next level of diversity, and more than 100 companies have tapped into your expertise, Carol, and your work. So welcome, and we're so glad to have you here.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here, Padma.
Thank you, Carol. And another book that Jeff chose for his folio is called Reboot. I love that title, Leadership and the Art of Growing Up. Yeah, it's a great title. And that book is written by Jerry Colonna. Jerry is the CEO and co-founder of a company called Reboot.io. It's an executive coaching and leadership development company committed to the notion. It's a great notion. Better human beings make better leaders. Like, what a novel concept. That sometimes leaders forget. And Jerry, for nearly 20 years, has helped entrepreneurs and others to lead with humanity and with resilience, having empathy, having our humanity as one of the, I would say, characteristics of leadership. So yeah, I'm so glad, Jeff, your folio brought all of us together today to discuss some of the greatest challenges. So welcome to all of you.
Thank you, Padma. It's great to be here and great to see everybody assemble here for one talk out of the folio. That's so cool.
So yeah, for those of you attending, please post questions as we go through in the chat channel. I'll be watching that, and at the end of the session, I will use those questions and address them to our panelists. If you have a specific question you want me to ask Jeff or Carol or Jerry, just put that in your chat, and I'll get that. So Jeff, I want to start with you. Tell me a little bit about how you discovered the phrase "ask your developer." How did you come up with that? And why is that mindset so important right now in 2021?
You know, it's funny. At nearly every company that I've ever met, everyone's talking about digital transformation, the importance of digital, right? Because as the way companies meet their customers has turned from, walking in the front door and greeting people in person to a digital experience. And I'm not just talking about COVID, I'm talking about the trend of the last 20 years, where the interface we have with businesses is in mobile apps or websites. Every business is becoming a digital business. And who is building those experiences but software developers? The people who with hands on keyboard actually doing the work and who understand the technology, who understand what's possible. Yet in most companies, people think of the software developers as, sort of like the code monkeys, the people who you just hand a spec to and they write code, and that's all that you expect of them. In fact, at a lot of companies, you've got this perception of developers like math geeks. You think of like Dennis Nedry from Jurassic Park, rolling around in the mud as the dinosaurs about to eat him, or you think of Steve Urkel from Family Matters. Right? You have this like notion of this geek, whereas the developers that I have known in my life are incredibly creative problem solvers who are capable of applying that problem solving to so many different domains. Yet at most companies, the developers are just handed a spec and said, here, write this. And it's almost as if, it's like a black box machine where you hand specifications, documents, and Mountain Dew in one end and you get code out the other and everyone's happy. But the best companies actually go to their developers with the best business problems they're trying to solve. Or the customer problems they're trying to solve, and say, treat them as partners and say, how can we solve this hard customer problem, this hard business problem? So in short, they ask their developers and make them partners in building the business. And, I kind of came across this phrase. I was always trying to figure out, like, how do I talk about this? And it really wasn't until Twilio bought a billboard about 6 years ago here in California on Highway 101. And we were trying to figure out what to say on the billboard. And we hired this marketing firm to come in and do all the research and pitch us ideas. And they talked to bunch of Twilio employees. They talked to a bunch of Twilio customers, and we had the pitch session, like you've seen it on TV, like in Mad Men, where they've got all the, the printed out slides, and they're like, here's our big idea. And I'll tell you, they were all horrible. So we had this like deadline where they needed to actually, like the company that did the billboards, they needed the art. And they said, you got to get us the art. And I remember it was a Friday afternoon, and I'm in this conference room with a few other folks on my marketing team, because we had to get this done. And I had this idea that's been floating around in my head for a while. It was based on those TV commercials for like pharmaceuticals, where, at the end where they say, ask your doctor if regurgitol is right for you. And I always had this, like, it just kind of clicked in my head, like, ask your developer if Twilio is right for you, right? Because if you thought of your developers as partners, then your developers could actually bring new tools like Twilio, but also new ideas and new technologies to the table to help you build the business. And so I just blurted this out. How about ask your developer? And there was like this pause, and they're like, what does that even mean? I'm like, I'm not sure, but I think it'll get it. So we ended up going with that. And what's interesting is it was a shortcut. It was, first of all, it was a tip of the hat, if you will, to the developers who are in the know and who know about a lot of new technologies. But it was also an acknowledgement to those developers and a wake-up call to the business people who are driving down the freeway, see this billboard of like, wait, why would I ask my developer about this weird thing called Twilio? But if it got people to think differently about, like, yes, you should ask your developer. You should talk to your developer. Actually, they're not scary people. They will talk to you, and bring them in to that process of building your products, your company. That amazing things will happen. So that's really where it started. But it wasn't until I wrote the book that I really fleshed out the ideas behind what does it mean to ask your developer? What does it mean to draw them into the business? And if you want to do that, how would you go about doing that? And that's really what I talk about in the book.
Awesome. It's a great book. So yeah, very practical advice. I think that's what I liked about it. So Carol, the next question is for you. And so you visited some very big companies, and I've been part of very big companies in the world. And you've talked about the importance of diversity and inclusion. You've talked about this, I think, at Microsoft. I'm on the board of Microsoft, in full disclosure. Google, McKinsey, companies like this. So how did you begin your work as a diversity advocate? What made you take that up as a podium that you wanted to be on? And what can companies do better to improve their diversity, right? Because I've been in the tech industry for a long time. Tech industry is notorious for not having a lot of as much diversity as we should have. We still don't have as many women, people of color in technology companies. So how would you say we should go about this?
Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here, and certainly a pleasure to hear Jeff describe how he came to write his book. And let me tell you how I came to diversity, and it's very personal. But I say that I'm a child of the civil rights movement. I marched on Washington with my parents when I was a child. And as a result of the civil rights movement, there were doors that opened for me that previously had been closed. And I was so cognizant that so many fought and died so that I could be in the companies, could be working in the companies that I had worked at. And so my responsibility was to help open those doors wider so more individuals of difference could come in. And the reason why we want to have more individuals of difference in is, as Jeff indicated, we want people to think differently. We want innovation. We want diversity of thought. We don't want the group think, as he experienced when he had the marketing team come in and gave the same cookie cutter approach. But we're looking for innovative ideas. And how you have that diversity of thought is by having people with different experiences, people of different backgrounds around the table who have a different perspective, who view life through a different lens, who can offer creativity. As a business, at the end of the day, you want to attract the best talent of all kinds. And in order to do that, you have to have an inclusive and creative environment that values diversity, that values difference, and a climate where everyone, regardless of who you are, feels that you belong. And that is what is going to get us to the future, particularly as we look at our millennials and our demographic shift. I don't need to tell you that, Padma. Our demographics are shifting.
Yeah.
And we want to make sure that we can attract the best talent of all kinds. And we have to create cultures that allow for that.
Yeah, right on. Thank you for that. That's a great personal story too. So Jerry, at reboot.io and in your book, you always talk about showing leaders how to reboot their lives and coping with emotional baggage and traumas sometimes that can hold us back in life and in business. So many people are seeking that, I guess, especially now, right? Coming out of the pandemic, we're all trying to figure out what it means to reboot ourselves, reboot our society, reboot work back. What are the most important questions one needs to ask oneself if you're motivated to start on this transformational process?
Well, thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me here. I feel really honored to be here. And I'm going to ask your indulgence I'm going to hold on that question and actually hopefully build on something that both Jeff and Carol were saying, and maybe even tie it back into the question here. Because I think this is a really important question. And I actually, first of all, I just want to say to my friend Jeff, you're a better human. And you've grown up. And I can feel that because in addition to the wisdom of ask your developer, as Carol pointed out, there's an implicit inclusivity in that act, right? And, you know, I can't say it better than Carol has said it about the importance of diversity. But if I may add to it, I think that the only way that we as a society are going to be able to address systemic oppression is to create systemic belonging. And systemic belonging begins with the individuals who hold power, who more often than not, they look like my meat bag looks. Having the courage to lean into the most difficult parts of their own life and grow up so that we can really go against the toxic expression of supremacy, white supremacy, patriarchy. And, you know you tell the story, Jeff, of ask your developer as a billboard thing, but one of the first comments that came up was bingo. And what I saw in that little bingo was, sometimes I feel like I don't belong. And if we can, I don't care how the angle in, whether it's you're asking your developers or how about asking everyone within the organization, what can we do better to create more humane, more belonging, more humanity, more belonging in the organization? So I didn't answer the direct question, Padma, because I was just too energized.
No, that's great. I think you brought emotion, and that's very
Yeah.
good, right? Because that's what great panels and great conversations do. That's what Fable's all about. Words move us, and when you read great words, they move us, and when you hear great words, they move us. So I'm glad you provided that, Jerry. I really appreciate that.
Well, if I can connect it back to even the pandemic time and the leadership challenge here. So Rhonda McGee's book, I'll recommend, The Inner Work of Racial Justice, brings this forth even more, which is that the work in the world will change when the work inside happens. And when I look at what happened in the last year, right, there was an increase in violence and violent expression because there was a revelation of suffering. There wasn't a creation of suffering, right? This has been going on. And the opportunity exists for all of us as leaders to learn to use times like this to answer deep questions about ourselves. Like, one of my organizing questions is, how have I been complicit, not responsible, complicit in creating the conditions in the world that I say I don't want, in myself and in my life? I say I don't want to be busy and I fill my calendar up. Okay, that's a really curious thing. Jeff is so sick of me asking him that question. The question last year for me that arose was, how have I been complicit and how have I benefited from the conditions in the outer world that I say I don't want? Mm-hmm. I say I want systems of belonging, and yet I have benefited from systems of unbelonging and othering. So what am I going to do about that? And that's the kind of internal reboot that gets me really pumped. It's when someone is willing to say, okay, it doesn't work, here's what I'm going to do. So
let me build on that. So is that internal reboot different for different individuals? And if so, how does one go about finding what a person needs to reboot?
So I think that the act of transformation, we've had myths and archetypes and stories and fables that teach us through multiple wisdom traditions about the arc of transformation. And it almost always begins with some sort of shattering, some sort of reconciliation, some reckoning is more the word. And you could even argue that from my lips to God's ears, our society is going through a reckoning, and that we don't forget this. And so the transformation begins with you know, I'm a Buddhist student of Buddhism, and I often think of the Buddha sitting down under the Bodhi tree to discover the Four Noble Truths as him saying, screw it, I'm done. It doesn't work anymore, right? This like exasperated moment. And so maybe there's that transformation begins, that rebooting begins with the recognition that it doesn't work anymore. It might be midlife, it might be a transition around a job, it might be someone, it might be a spouse or a partner coming to you and saying, you know, this thing, it doesn't work. What do you mean it? Nope, doesn't work. And that becomes the call. The people who suffer are the people, and every wisdom tradition teaches this, the people who suffer are the people who ignore the call.
Great. So Jeff, you picked Carol's book, which by the way, till Jeff had picked it, I had heard of it, but I haven't like fully read it, and I did now. So thank you for bringing that book on my radar, Jeff. So why is diversity important to you? And I mean, have you explicitly done things at Twilio to encourage diversity within your teams and how you bring teams together?
Absolutely. Diversity, inclusion, and belonging has been a big part of Twilio. And I'll tell you why. There's been a number of influences on my thinking. And when I started Twilio back in 2008, I will admit diversity, inclusion, and belonging were not on my radar. You know, I have like basically every form of privilege there is. I'm white. I'm a man. I experienced, you know, I was raised in a upper middle class, and I got a good education, right? And so I just sort of assumed, oh, this is the experience everybody has, right? And like, you know, we all go on our way in life. And I was very fortunate to have some early investors in Twilio in Mitch and Freda Kapoor. I don't know if anyone is familiar.
Of course.
With Freda. And, you know, it's funny, like they would invite me to dinners pretty frequently about diversity in tech and building diverse companies. And this is the very early days of Twilio when we're like 4 or 5 people. And I'm like, I'm just trying to stay in business. I'm trying to, not, like go out of business tomorrow. And I was always like, what a luxury it would be to think about diversity. When I've got nothing better to do, I can think about that. And that was, it's like, it wasn't that flippant, but it was really like, okay, I saw the email. I'm not, I don't have time for that. And eventually, after many times, I did go to one of those dinners. And what opened my eyes about this was, first of all, just the facts, the academic work, everything out there that says diverse companies perform better, have better returns, et cetera. Like the proven fact that diverse companies perform better. And I was like, oh, that's interesting. But I always sort of thought that, well, at some point later, you hire, diversity teams when you're a big company. But I had this realization, like, when is the right time to start focusing on diversity? Like after we're 1,000 white male engineers, like, is that the time when we should start thinking about diversity? And that realization that essentially the people you attract into your company largely reflect the company that you already are. And to overcome that bias, you have to do an incredible amount of work. And the earlier you begin that work, the more likely you are to actually succeed in building a truly diverse company. And the way I conceptualized it is that in order to fulfill on our mission, we need every talented person on the planet to want to work at Twilio, who has the skills that we need and has the who can help us on our journey. And when they come in the door and interview at Twilio, they have to look around and say, you know what, I will succeed here. This is a place where I will do my best work. And if they look around and they don't see an environment that looks like a place where they'll do the best work, and they don't see people who look like them in our environment, they're not going to want to work at Twilio. Mm-hmm. And that type of environment doesn't create itself, is the key thing that I think I realized on that day. That it's not like you have a diverse group of people walking in your door every day interviewing and you just hire, the best person for each role. You have to work at getting a diverse slate of people in the door. And once they're in the door, you have to work at ensuring you have an environment where every person is going to succeed. Those things don't just happen on their own. And so that's the work that we've been doing for the past, probably 8-9 years, as we focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. at Twilio. And I'll say belonging is the number one thing that we actually work on.
Yeah.
And the reason why a lot of people think of diversity as the statistics, the numbers, how many people you've hired of a certain category. And it's like, while those are ways to measure your progress, if you aren't first and foremost focused on belonging, where everybody in the company feels like they can do their best work, then you can hire all you want. They're just going to leave.
Yeah.
And so we focus on belonging first, because that enables you, when you have a population in the company that is diverse and feels great about their work and feel like they belong, that's when you can bring in more people and have them be successful. And that's when people will want to recruit their friends. And so that is the key that we found. So belonging first, and then diversity, which often sort of implies the recruiting aspects of it, and everything else.
I think that's so great. And it's music to my ears. I've actually now started exclusively talking about belonging for that reason. I think it's one thing to have a diverse group of employees or team members, but if part of the group feels they're alienated or they don't feel like they can contribute, then they're going to just leave, and then you're back to square one. Which brings me, Carol, to you. I think, hiring practices are really, really important. I think it has to be front and center, as Jeff pointed out. I always say the first 10 people hire the next 100 people, next 100 people hire the next 1,000 people. So you have to start focusing on culture and belonging and inclusion right from the get-go. Like, my company is only like 18 people now, and I talk about it, we talk about it, we focus on it. So Carol, maybe you can talk a little bit about, how companies can think about diversity as part of their strategic hiring. And then, is there a connection between, these days everybody talks about employees being stressed out, stress, anxiety, loneliness, now that we're all remotely working. These are all high on the radar. And for me, it almost feels like there's a connection between the two. If I feel like I can belong, my stress levels go down, but I don't have data around it. It's basically anecdotally, I know that to be true. Do you have any experience in relating, I guess, two questions for you: hiring, diversity, inclusion? What are some techniques companies have successfully deployed? And secondly, do you see a connection between diverse teams being able to better cope with or have better resilience?
Well, those are two great questions. And first and foremost, I just want to thank all of you for going deep. We don't always have the occasions. We rarely have the occasions when we go deep in these conversations. So I appreciate your vulnerability, because one has to be vulnerable to go deep. So thank you for sharing so much of yourselves. When we think about diversity, one of the things, and it's been said really, we have to move outside of our traditional recruiting areas. We can't just assume we're going to find difference in the same recruiting areas we have been going to. So we have to expand our networks. We have to look at historically Black colleges. By the way, happy Black History Month. And I'm glad you're having this conversation during Black History Month. You also must know that if you don't have a lot of diversity, it's so important just to acknowledge that as you look to hire. And you say to people who you are recruiting, that is why it's so important that you're here, because I need you to help with these efforts. I'm not only hiring for technical skills and your leadership skills, but we really want to create a diverse environment, and I need your help in that. And so it's everyone's responsibility to create a diverse environment. And when we think about productivity and we think about belonging, from a business perspective, employees are 30% more productive when they feel they can bring their whole self to work, as opposed to feeling I have to operate within a certain box to succeed in this organization. That puts stress on an employee. They're not performing to their maximum. And so when an employee feels that they can bring their whole self to work, whomever there might be, they are far more productive, they're far more creative, and they feel like they belong. And it's not only the employee, they see all the various differences in the company, and they feel like everyone belongs. And that's universal. And so it feels like the UN. And that's the kind of environment you want to create, because at the end of the day, we're a global society and we want to value everyone. And we want that in our companies. And that is really so important when it comes to belonging.
Yeah.
I can just tell you one story. When I was interviewing for the ABC TV affiliate here as a manager, director, I came, as we always do, as we're always apt to do, and arrived at the appointment 15 minutes earlier because, as Jeff says, you want to see who's walking through the lobby, who is in the environment, what does this culture look like? And I saw so many different types of individuals. But I knew that place was for me when I saw a man with pink furry slippers walk by. And it's in the book. And I knew I could succeed there and just be myself and be valued. And those are huge signals that you can just be who you are and do your best work. And it was tough leaving that organization.
Yeah.
But I had to leave to grow.
That's such a great story. I actually have the opposite of the story where you were saying you have to bring your whole self or you can be productive. So I'm an engineer by training and I'm from India originally. And I came to the US to go to graduate school. And I started working right after graduate school in the semiconductor industry, which is pretty hardcore tech. Even in the tech, it's like the hardcore male-dominated part of the tech industry. I started working in this facility. There were probably like 5 women in the entire facility, and I was working in the factory in the semiconductor fab. And somebody once came to tell me, and I think they thought they were being kind to me, to say, like to fit in here, maybe you shouldn't wear bright colors to work. Like we all just wear like black or gray. I grew up in India where color is celebrated.
Yeah.
I'm used to having chunky
Yeah.
bright colors. I'm just so glad to see you wear bright colors.
Yeah.
That was very much not part of me. And I really tried for a year. But every day I would get dressed to go to work, I would feel miserable.
Yes.
I literally felt like I was leaving a big part of myself at home when I went to work. And it was just eating me up, and I could never be happy at work. And, although maybe I was trying really hard to be this brilliant engineer, I couldn't, because there's just such a big part of me that was not there. So yeah, after a year, I said, forget this. I'm just going to go back to wearing whatever I want, whatever colors I want. But yeah, it's just even small things make a huge difference in defining.
That's your identity. It's saying your identity doesn't fit here.
Yeah.
That was the message.
That's right. And it was so, it was just, at a surface level, it just feels like, oh, that's trivial. It shouldn't bother you. But I think it is, as Jerry was talking about, it's sort of like we all have to reboot sometimes these assumptions, and, things matter to people, and we have to pay attention to understanding where they're coming from. So yeah, I appreciate you sharing that.
I think it's interesting, right? As executives at companies, there's a lot of pressure to put on the veneer of like an executive,
Mhm.
to look like an executive, to sound like an executive. And what that really is, I guess maybe there's some people that's who they really are. I doubt it. There's a lot of pressure though to do it. And so to be authentic, to be your weird self,
Mhm.
as an executive and as a leader, I think gives permission to other people to do the same.
Yes.
And
Yes.
and so one of the things that I generally try to do is to not, polish off some of those corners and, not try to hide who I am. And, the way that often ends up coming across is like we have all hands meetings and they are sometimes incredibly awkward. And I just lean into that. And I think I love that. It's one of the things I love about Twilio is that it doesn't feel scripted and it doesn't feel like we are trying to just put forth one sort of heavily scripted, heavily veneered thing.
Yeah.
And I think that sends a message to everybody. And I enjoy those moments.
Authentic.
Yeah. Authenticity.
Authentic.
Yeah.
If I could probably knit something together here. Carol used a powerful phrase, which was acknowledge the problem. And there's something really powerful in simply acknowledging that the reality of what's going on. So acknowledging, for example, that many of us carry preconceived notions of what does it mean to lead well.
Mhm.
And that buried within that preconceived notion is a kind of disconnection from the reality of who we are. And that grows. Now, again, if someone who holds power, someone who's in a leadership position is willing to acknowledge that that is a reality, that is what is going on, that's what we're working with, it does create these conditions that are safer for people.
Mhm.
And I don't want to lose the thread of something that you asked Padma about mental health. And I know that this is also part of the core of Fable here. One of the things that also needs acknowledging is that human beings are struggling right now.
Mhm.
Boy, howdy, this is really a hard time.
Mhm.
And that we don't really know the fullness of what someone is going through. This person's aunt has COVID and that person's child is still not in person in school. And they're trying to balance these things. And sometimes in our rush to make it all better, we fail to acknowledge that.
Mhm.
We fail to acknowledge the problems, to use Carol's phrase. And then we miss an opportunity for that currency that's so great, which is empathy. Right? Think about what's happening amongst the four of us right now. There's this like beautiful little empathetic connection. We have very, very different life experiences, but we have this connection.
Mhm.
And that is the opportunity. And when leaders foster that, then someone gets to raise their hand and say, I'm struggling.
Mhm.
And isn't that an expression of belonging? To be able to say that?
Yeah. Feel comfortable in saying that without feeling like you may be judged, right? Because the pace is so brutal sometimes in how quickly in tech we have to move. I think just allowing people to breathe and take a breather and pause it's giving permission to be human. I think as Jeff always talks about, give yourself permission to be human.
Yeah.
So Jerry, I think building on that, you talk about radical self-inquiry as a concept in your books. So tell me more about and tell us more about that. What do you mean by that, and how could somebody put that to practice? What does radical self-inquiry mean?
So it's just a phrase I coined a few years ago to describe the process by which one compassionately and skillfully strips away the mask, at least to yourself, so that you're there, you're fully there, you're not hiding anymore, right? To build upon this notion of acknowledging the problem, some folks even struggle to acknowledge to themselves that things aren't right, or that they, haven't a clue how to do their job. I mean, one of the first things I'll do when I talk to first-time CEOs, I might have a group of them and I'll say, who here is brave enough to admit they haven't a clue as to what to do their job? right? Padma, yeah, there we go. See, right? I mean, no matter how experienced you are, and you're enormously capable, enormously experienced, you have that little voice in your head that says, well, now you're in it, right? And what we're doing right now is both radical because we don't do it. Carol pointed out that we don't go deep. Why not? Right? So it's radical because it's not done often enough, right? And it's self-inquiry. By the way, it's not self-flagellation. It's not, oh, what's wrong with me? It's really, I said the word before, how have I been complicit, right? That phrase. But here's a simple one. How are you? Like, no bullshit. Like Jeff is used to me asking him this. No, really, how are you? Well, it's been a rough day. I'm tired. I'd rather not be here. Right? Okay, from that place, we acknowledge where we are. So that's what I mean by that phrase, radical self-inquiry. By unpacking that and then saying, you get to answer the other question, which I like, which is, what kind of leader would you like to be? So Padma, what kind of CEO would you like to be? Because you're not Jeff. That's that.
Yeah, that's great. All right, I'm seeing a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll go to them. And as a reminder to our participants, if you have questions, please post them in the chat. So there's a question here. It says, I loved reading in Jeff's book about Chi Chu's read-only approach to meetings. It demonstrates a commitment to belonging and sounds like it could be a useful strategy towards opening doors, as Carol points out, and driving diversity and inclusion. So Jeff, do you want to, or Carol, one of you jump in and talk a little bit about how that might help?
Happy to. For those who haven't read this part of the book, I'll give the quick background. One of the chapters I talk about how do you create an open learning environment, an environment where people are encouraged to learn. And you think about it like in school, we learn lots of things. We also learn how to learn, like lower school, right? And somehow we graduate from high school or college, and we're just sort of expected to now know things and to just do things, right? And there isn't this emphasis on learning later in life. Yet when you are building, especially a technology company, and really any company now that is at the forefront of changing conditions in society and driven by technology and moving fast, and that's pretty much every industry that there is, what you need to be actually doing is learning constantly, because there aren't answers. Unlike in grade school, where the teacher asks you the question, what's 1 + 2? There is an answer and the teacher knows it. They just want you to figure it out. In business, nobody knows the answer to these questions. And so it is actually the companies and the people in those companies who are able to learn the fastest. Like, they're literally the ones who are going to find out answers to the unknown, the unknown answers in business and in society that actually drive things forward. And so we need to have an environment of learning in every company if we're going to succeed. And part of that is stripping away the idea that people already know the answers and that veneer of like, of course I have to know the answer. And second, though, is teaching people to learn, reminding people that actually we are learning continually throughout life. And in building the company, we have to learn every day. And so one of the things that my chief product officer, Chi Chu, does is when he holds a business review with one of the teams, he makes them open so that anybody in the company can actually attend or can watch them after the fact on video. And the effect is that everybody can learn the lessons that team is learning in that meeting. So they can learn from the discussion, they can learn from the questions he's asking and how people answer it. And the interesting thing, you mentioned the read-only aspect of those meetings. And it sounds like, wow, so what that is a shortcut for is in those meetings, there are what he calls, because he's an engineer, he calls them read-write participants, meaning they can speak and listen. And then there's the read-only participants, they can only listen. And you might say, how is that inclusive, telling people to shut up? But what it does is, if anyone's ever been in a meeting with 100 people and everyone trying to talk, obviously that's fairly chaotic. And so the way he makes it tenable for 100 people to listen in on the meeting and learn from it is to say, you're kind of in the gallery, like I kind of imagine the medical school students in the surgery, like watching from above. Like, it's not just like, hey, anybody, I'm going to grab the scalpel and give it a try. It's like, no, you're here to learn. You're observing. And then in the center of that arena is where the sort of the active participation is going on. And so in doing so, you create the sort of read-write group who are actually having the meeting, and the read-only group who are there to observe, listen, and learn. And I think that's a really interesting way to create an environment. And by the way, there's no skin off the back of the people in the meeting. They don't have to do any extra work. The fact that now everybody else can learn from this experience. And I think that's a fascinating approach. And that's why I talked about it in the book.
Awesome.
Open learning environment, and the practice is called the Open Product Review.
Open product review. I should.
And if I can add to that, it's so interesting that Jeff mentioned that, because after our summer of racial awareness, CEOs have been asking, what do I do? What do I do? And the model that I've created is very simple. And that's three things. It's listen, because it's so important to listen to other people who are having these experiences. And Jerry mentioned it as well. Listen, just, and don't listen so that you listen to give the answer. You know how that is. You're just simply listening to people. Listen, learn, and then enact change. But this is a real opportunity for us to listen and understand, learn what is going on in our country, learn what has been happening for centuries regarding racial inequities, and then how can I, as a leader, enact change? Because Jerry's right, because by one's mere birth, when one is born, if you are born white, you are born with privilege. You didn't do that. You are just born with white privilege. Others of color have doors that are so close to them that whites are just open. Doors open. So when you listen, you have an opportunity to understand those closed doors. You're learning and thinking about, what can I do? And then you enact change. You work together to enact change. So thank you for sharing your model, Jeff, because it really reminded me of that's how we really change environments.
Yeah, so I know we are drawing up close to the end here. So maybe my last question I'll ask, and each of you can answer. So 2021, new year, and hopefully different year in many respects from 2020. Maybe each of you can think about, what are you most optimistic about in 2021? What are you most fearful about? Is there anything in 2021 that causes you fear? If you think back on what we went through, whoever wants to go first can go.
I'm happy to go first. I think when I think about what I'm optimistic about, first of all, obviously it's got to be uphill from 2020. So just having that belief, right? And then more specifically, though, I think we learned a lot of things because of the pandemic that we wouldn't have discovered otherwise. And now applying those things to our lives, to business, et cetera, is going to play out for years and decades to come. So for example, Twilio, and I'm sure many other companies, learned that we can have employees working in a much more flexible environment than we probably thought was possible. And now we can apply that. And in doing so, I think create better conditions for our employees. People don't have to commute into an office that they didn't want to be commuting into. They can have a higher quality of life because maybe they live further from an office in a place where they can afford more space and things like that. And we can recruit a much more diverse talent pool because we will probably not be bound by the same geographic decisions and restrictions that we would have otherwise. And so the implications of that for the happiness of our employee base, the diversity of our employee base, and the productivity of our employee base are pretty profound. And I'm excited to actually enact the results of that, especially not when you're under duress. Like, I get it, everyone working from home during a pandemic, not the best, but we made it work. Applying those lessons when you're not under that duress. That's what I'm looking to.
Awesome. Anything you're fearful about?
I'm fearful of these new variants, not being vaccine relevant. I am fearful for democracy. The decline of democracy worldwide, including in the United States, is certainly a concerning trend. And I'm concerned about that we won't have learned our lessons from the election of 2020 and the transfer of power in 2020, and that we won't use this opportunity to strengthen our democracy.
Great answer. Carol?
I was hopeful on January 5th when Georgia elected a Black reverend from Martin Luther King's church and a young white Jewish man who was the son of immigrants. And then the next day they stormed the US Capitol with the Confederate flag. So all that joy reflected that there still is this undercurrent in this country that does not want to see progression. And while the media has been calling it insurrection, and then impeachment, and then inauguration, which gave you so much hope. And there was a time there when we finally took the time to acknowledge, Jerry, and to mourn, which we haven't had that. And it felt good to exhale. I see the only way forward with another I, and that's inclusion. We have to make sure that everyone, regardless of who you are, feels included, that we have a job for everybody, that middle of America feels that we have not left them behind. And so I'm hopeful for that, but I'm fearful if we do not do that, this will only continue.
Great, very thoughtful. Thank you, Jerry.
So I share some of the same optimisms and some of the same fears, but I'll share it in this way. I am profoundly optimistic as a person. It's a way that I respond to the world, and so I'm optimistic about science. Holy mackerel! Look what we did! Like, wow, right? Vaccines in record time. But there are other things that make me optimistic. I have had more profoundly real conversations since the pandemic than I had in decades before. Mm. And this is my trade. This is what I do. Mm. But we're having more and more of these kinds of conversations where it's supposedly about one thing, but it's really about this much deeper issue. Thank God. Doesn't it feel like liberating? Because we can name things and we can talk about it. I'm optimistic about masking. What do I mean by that? I can't think of a more powerful symbol of our interdependence than the fact that I need each of you to wear a mask when you go outside. And I promise you I will wear a mask, even though we're not in the same world, because that's how viruses work. Mm-hmm. And so I need you. You need me. And now I can acknowledge that. I don't have to pretend that that isn't true. What a profoundly beautiful symbol, as painful as it is. So there's a lot that I carry that's optimistic. And yes, it has this edge to it. And then I fear for our democracy. I do. And we're talking about it. You know, the imbalance of power and the brokenness of our system didn't occur last year. Trumpism is not the problem,
Right.
it's the symptom,
Symptom. Right.
right?
Right.
So again, Carol's phrase, acknowledge the problem here. System doesn't work. And it didn't work. It doesn't just work for the folks who say voted one way. It doesn't work for the folks who voted the other way. That's why they voted that way. Whatever way you want to take. So we need to address that together. Hopefully with the same speed that we developed mRNA vaccines. Right?
Here.
Right? And, you know, hey, Jeff, should I ask my developer to solve the democracy problem?
Yeah, we need a laboratory where with computer models, we can design the perfect democracy and then inject it into people's governments.
Because that's a big problem.
So I want to wrap this up and thank you, each of you, for all the time. Carol, you especially dialing in from the East Coast. It's getting late for you. Very special thanks to you. You know, just to summarize, we've covered everything from acknowledge the problem, radical self-inquiry, being honest with ourselves, belonging, Jeff, beyond inclusion and diversity, Jeff's message, some tips about creating open product reviews, something that I am personally going to take away from here. Thank you for all your insights. We'll summarize this and also have a recording available for people that couldn't join today but wanted to listen to it. And I think it's been a great conversation. We've covered so many different topics. It's a pleasure to get to know each of you, and hopefully we'll stay connected through our lives and build friendships.
And don't worry, Padma. Yes, Padma, you've got it. Don't worry about being CEO.
Okay.
Padma, you're fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you, Padma, for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
I love
Be
Fable.
well, everybody.
Bye.
Hey. Bye, guys. Bye, all.